All right, Brad. So we've got looks like four more people, or would you like to just go ahead and get started, and they can jump in with their thoughts when they get here?
I'd say let's go ahead. All right, thank you.
All right. Well, welcome everybody to another night at the Critiquery. Tonight we have read a piece by Brad called I've got it pulled up right here. Terran Horizons. It's a science fiction piece, and we are going to go around and do the normal thing, which is give us your opening thoughts. Try to keep it to 60 seconds or less, if at all possible. Something you liked, and something we can talk more about that might be worthy of critique. And we'll start with Jared. How about you, Jared?
Certainly. So something that I really enjoyed was the how far we got into the character. I felt really immersed in the world and what was happening, and I felt pretty grounded in the situation that was going on. And something to talk more about would be exposition, and on a related note, where the story starts.
All right. Thank you so much, Jared. Anna, what were your thoughts?
Yet again, I really liked the world building. I thought that it was really immersive. And I did like the characters, though I think that it relied on a lot of narration, which could end up going into that show versus tell category, and not as much action. So I think that if you put more action to it, just kind of like Jared said, start at a different position so that the story kind of moves along a little better, you get a better hook, that I think it would be more engaging for the reader.
Thank you, Jared. That's fantastic. Terry, what were your thoughts?
I like the concept. I liked a police procedural and the threat of an intergalactic species war 15,000 light years from Earth. So the world was foreign enough that it was intriguing, but also familiar enough. I was distracted by a number of stylistic and structural quirks that kind of bogged me down, but I'll talk more about that during the meeting.
Very cool. I'm excited to hear what those are. Keaton, what were your thoughts? Something positive and something else worthy of critique.
Yeah, I agree with what a couple people have said already. I really like the world building, and I like where it's going, the mysteries there, and kind of can see the trajectory of what it's going to be about. Something to talk about is, I think it's a question, so I'll just leave it vague for now, but just some of like the side characters. Yeah.
Thank you, Keaton. Laura, what were your thoughts? Something positive, something worthy of critique.
Yeah, I am really intrigued by this idea of a world where violence, I guess, or just murder in particular, but violence in general is not common. And that was something that I want to learn more about. And I think that was handled well with all of the officers being clearly like unsure what to do in the situation. And something that could be, I think somebody mentioned this already, but the way that the characters are developed could be a bit more showing and less telling.
Thank you, Laura. Kim, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, so I gotta admit, I only read the first 2 or 3 pages, I think, but from that I got a lot. I really liked the level of writing. It felt just, wow, really polished, sophisticated, and very high level. I like the precision. It seemed like so medically almost like precise, and I can't really explain it, but it was a little bit like cold, analytical, kind of scientific writing. And then I guess an area that I thought about was there's a little bit of like telling in the dialogue, and then some of that the style of the writing, like cold and analytical. I get it. It's like science fiction, which I don't read a ton of. So I think that's a new style of writing for me. But I didn't feel sometimes too close to the characters because of that. I almost felt like, wow, or the scene, I felt like, wow, am I really there? Like sometimes to get into a scene, I have to like, they have to like touch something or feel something or like sense so that I kind of can connect. But again, this is science fiction, so it's kind of like in a different world too. I think I made it under 60 seconds. So.
You did great, Kim. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And Ian, what were your thoughts?
Brad, I may have read an earlier draft of this piece a few years ago. I really like the world. I think a futuristic utopia where, like Anna said, violence isn't a thing is really cool. That's something to aspire to. It sounds like humanity's doing right when they travel to the stars. And I think that the character's central struggle, the narrative framework, and the criminal conspiracy type of story are all really fantastic elements. Like I think that you've done a really good job of laying the groundwork for what I hope comes next and what I would expect to come next. And then what I would want to talk more about or what I want to address. I have thoughts and answer to all of your specific questions, but I guess the one that resonated with me the most was John's internal monologue. I have some thoughts about how well it's working in places and maybe how it could be shored up to be more consistent and also put us closer into John's head as a character. So I really enjoyed it. And I think that it's going places.
Thank you, Ian. And I will add that I think there's a lot, as the authors probably heard, there's a lot to enjoy in this. The characters, the capacity of the story moving forward, the groundwork that's been laid, like Kim said, just the utter pointed writing that puts you right where it clearly wants you to be, and then moves you in a way that I think at least gives you great confidence that the author is telling you the story they want and not kind of being led around by desperation or confusion or any of that stuff. And so that I find fantastic. Something I'd want to talk about, there's some stuff that's already been brought up that I think is great, and we'll definitely get into it. Something that stood out to me was maybe the difficulty I had in understanding some of the conceits of the world. I maybe had the opposite reaction of Ian in relation to this kind of, I thought it was really interesting, the idea of an authoritarian kind of fascistic utopia and how that would play out and how that would leave the characters. And it seems like the author's pretty well interested in the morality or the philosophical underpinnings, or we'll get to there, and that seemed really intriguing. But maybe the conceit of how we got to a place where there's so little violent crime. I know there's a part where it mentions like education camps, but the specifics of how that's possible given the normal conditions of human beings, and just maybe the physical like ability to see the world. The Fulgen, the alien race, is explored really well in the beginning, but some of the rest of the physical world I had trouble seeing. But that would be it for my thoughts. Let's go ahead and move to the. Actually, let me ask you, Brad. You have some great questions here. Do you want us to go ahead and move into your questions, or was there anything you wanted to drill down on from what you've heard in the opening feedback?
I feel like several people mentioned the showing versus the telling, which was, I mean, I think somewhat or tangentially one of my questions. So I would say if we could quickly move through the questions, I would hope that after that, I would love to follow up on a point you made, Jared made, and Ian made for sure. But I, you know what, I'm also willing to say you should just go wherever you think it should go, because I think you'll do an excellent job bringing out quality feedback.
Thank you so much, Brad. But we're here for you, so I will do what I think you'd like. So we'll start with these questions. How well does this chapter introduce the characters? And we had a little bit of that. I think the people who focused on that, one of them was Laura. You had said something about how the characters, well, you just mentioned the characters in your feedback, so maybe you could expand on that.
Yeah, for sure. I think the thing that I noticed the most was that I think the main character, I'm forgetting their name right, John, is described as somebody who's pretty taciturn and standoffish and isn't really into talking about his feelings, but his internal monologue conveys that he's really self-aware, which sort of didn't jive well with that description of him, that he doesn't like talking about his feelings. He's pretty or like doesn't man a few words. I thought that didn't quite come across in the way that he acted or interacted with other characters. I would have liked to see more of that rather than hear it about him. I think one other place that I was a little bit confused was the part that was describing one of the other officers as really similar to John, but like even a step, like even more moral than he was. And there was clearly some tension there that maybe will come out later, but that left me a little bit confused. And I think I would have liked more in that moment about those characters' relationship.
And let me remind everybody, please jump in at any time. Totally, this doesn't have to be just me calling on people we love if you jump in. But Laura, let me follow up with you on that. You said, and I think the other character you were talking about was the other military member. Is that right?
I think he's another police officer or detective, but not as high level as the main character.
It's Rizek, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. I don't mean to jump in, but I want to definitely agree there that the line kind of called attention to their similarities, where I said that, it was just like me, only more so. And I wanted to feel either more of their similarity or more of that difference, or for there to be a more substantial difference between those two to better distinguish them. And it was, I think it particularly hit home when Rizek ordered that somebody go to the owner of the vehicle's apartment and check it out. And John was like, oh, there's a squad already on the way. That does show pretty well that they were on the same wavelength, but it also kind of retreads the same thought process. So I don't know. I think there may be an opportunity to cut the telling there and keep the showing, and it shows their similar line of thinking.
I think that's a great point. Laura, going back to you, did you have any thoughts on any of the other characters? I know there was the younger female detective, and there was also the John's boss, for lack of a better term. If you had any thoughts on those characters?
The younger female detective definitely stood out as somebody who's very eager, just based on how she showed up. I think later we see her as a little bit more hesitant. I'm trying to remember when exactly that was. Like maybe when they're surveying, or no, when he asks her opinion and she seems reluctant to share her opinion. I thought that seemed out of character based on the previous description of her being sort of like eager and ready to jump in. And I feel like we don't know a ton about the boss yet. Like I thought the glimpse of her was interesting, with her as her in sort of her bathrobe, showing that she's really comfortable with the main character, with the child there. That was a nice glimpse, but I think we don't quite need her character to be fully developed yet, since she's not as present.
I was going to say, I think some other people mentioned this as well in the preliminary notes, but just the idea that we do get a lot of who these side characters are from the narrator. When they're first on the page, we kind of get maybe for a few of them a little paragraph or a few sentences of how John feels about them, and kind of like the cliff notes of their relationship. And I did feel that that kind of stuff doesn't really tend to stick too much. I think you kind of tend to forget that once you read it. You're like, oh, okay. Whereas if you see it, then of course it sticks more. And if you have to show it anyways, then there's not really maybe that much of a need to have that first bit where you kind of, or we're kind of told a little how John relates to them. Although I thought all of that was interesting, and I'd like to see all of it explored, and it was all seemed like really good choices. I just wanted to see it in action.
Jared, did you feel like there was sufficient characterization in action for a lot of that stuff? Because I know what you're talking about, the little short bios that were given about character relationships and personalities.
Yeah, I mean, that's true also. For instance, for a superior officer, I think, like Laura mentioned, seeing how comfortable they were interacting with him, that he was so comfortable seeing them and their son and interacted with both of them, that, showed that relationship. The eagerness of that officer who showed up would clearly be contrasting with John's personality that we see on the page. So we probably didn't need that, I don't think. There's one character, it's talked about how similar they are to each other. Is that Rizik or is that somebody else? It is Rizik. So that's the one I think other people have already mentioned, where maybe seeing a bit more of their differences, and in a situation where maybe having that intro summary almost handy, kind of ties your hands a little bit in that, then that, okay, well, they're very similar then. And so maybe showing instead of that telling will give the author more freedom to develop the characters as the story goes on.
And Keaton, this was something you mentioned as well in your opening, was about the side characters, I think is how you put it. So I'm wondering if you can expand on your thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with what everybody was saying. I think I liked a lot of seeing inside the main character's thoughts, and I got a pretty good sense of, him as a character. I just feel like, especially in the main scene of being on the crime scene, and I just thought there was a lot of names thrown out or around, which is not bad. I just kind of got like there's characters, and I just didn't know outside of the main character, like who's going to be significant moving on. And again, like, a couple people have said, just got like a little bit blurb of some of these other characters and like their personalities, but didn't see much after that. So I think they just kind of like melded into like just names for me at one point. So I just like to see a little bit, more of these different personalities shine through, so I can get a little bit better sense of these, other characters, side characters, and how they're interacting with the main character. What was the other thing? This is kind of about characters, but also the world building. And I know a couple people had mentioned it. It obviously shows that, they're not used to this violence in their place. And so, a lot of them are, reacting in a, shocking way because, it's not something they've dealt with. I guess I was just confused about, again, like, how did they get to this point? What do they do instead then? Like, what is their role if this isn't what they're dealing? Because so they were like, peacekeeping officers, and I get that a little bit, but again, it's like, if this isn't like a normal thing for them, and like, what are they, I guess, doing from their day to day that makes this even more so like crazy that they haven't seen this before?
So one thing it seemed like the author was trying to do was have the characters react to the violence, the kind of shocking violence they were seeing, in a way that gave that characterized each of the people. Keaton, did you feel like there was a connection? Like, were you able to recognize these characters by their reactions to the violence, or and I'm asking, by the way, because you had said that they kind of mushed a little. There's a lot of characters and a lot of stuff going on, so I get that, but I'm just trying to nail down maybe some of the ways that you did find them differentiated.
Yeah, I mean, if a lot of these junior level people are not used to this, like they're probably, going to react very similarly. So, I mean, that's part of that too. I guess when it comes to that, it was just kind of, again, told like, this isn't normal, but like, if I don't know if there's not like a whole flashback scene, but if there's something that kind of shows like what, what they're doing normally. And there was a couple things like this hasn't happened in blah, 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 so many years, but just kind of little more tidbits of why it's not normal instead of just telling like, oh, this isn't normal. And yeah, I don't know, it's up to you, but I mean, again, if they're not used to this, like they're probably all going to have a very similar reaction, but I guess there's ways you can play with how they react based on their personality. If the one guy Rizik is like similar to the main character, they're obviously going to have maybe similar reactions, but I feel like the woman was very eager, and so seems like she could have like a little more outwardly reaction to what's happening than the other two would have. So just kind of playing their reactions into their personalities.
Yeah, that's great stuff, Keaton. Thank you. And I know the author asked us to move through the questions, and I've been dilly-dallying here. So let me just open this up instead of pointing at everybody. Did anybody else have any thoughts? Anna, I saw you smiling at a couple of things. I don't know if you had any thought. And the specific question, just to remind you, was... oh, sorry, go
ahead. So character development. Definitely agree, reiterating the idea that kind of the narration about how he feels about them is not as important as the way he interacts with them. I was kind of thinking in the same vein where he's talking about how much he does not want to drive with Officer Ryzek because of how talkative he is. And then when they get to the scene with him, he's not all that talkative and asking a lot of questions. So instead of kind of getting their interactions, we get this inner narrative about how he's so similar to him, except for his like possible grandstanding of morality, which kind of maybe ticks him off since your main guy, John, seems to be having a problem with morality or his own idea of his own internal thought process. And then on top of it, like the girl who he actually really likes is the definition of what he was talking about, of talkative, asks a lot of questions, is still pretty morally upright as far as I could tell. So there seems to be kind of a clash in why he would like one versus the other, especially when their character interactions don't match the descriptions.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Anna. Ian or Terry or Kim, did you guys have any thoughts on character? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next question.
Yeah, I don't know how well the characters were developed by the action. We get a lot of John's feelings on things, and he kind of goes between being ultra sensitive and being antisocial, or kind of at one point he says I hate people. That's early on, and then later on he tells his coworkers I like and respect you. So I don't know if he's just being concealing himself, that there's some inconsistencies, and it seems like a lot of the subtleties are so tight in a world that's almost anti-drama in some of its structural elements, that it's hard to come away with a sharp picture of the characters and other things.
Yeah, I think I agree with Terry on that. Like, I was thinking about what is it about the characters that might have been a little bit difficult for me to make a clear picture, and that's the main character, even his inner monologue and what he says about himself, doesn't match like the style of the main story, the clinical precision, because he throws things out, like especially I hate myself. I was so confused by that because it's just such a blanket statement. And some of his comments about the other characters just don't seem, I don't know if it's not thought out, but it's just not subtle. It's like just telling somebody, yeah, like I don't know. I was thinking like in those instances, telling about Ryzak or, his boss or whatever, like there would just be like I think it would actually work better, not to tell you what to do, but have things happen organically that we are like, it makes it more subtle and interesting. And we'd be like, oh, so that's the way it is between them. But when the character just says it, I have a hard time like basically picturing it, because yeah, I guess it was in juxtaposition to the cold clinical precision of the storytelling and the sci-fi world. Yeah, it just didn't seem that emotional, like Terry said. And then it was very like almost petty a little bit, like his comments about others. But that's all I have to say about character development.
Thank you, Kim. Oh, Ian, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just have two quick thoughts that haven't been mentioned yet. The first was an observation of John's interaction with Kate and George as those secondary characters. He seems to address them and interact with them as a pair. And the only downside, the only thing you lose when you do that is you lose John's ability to show his individuality and his similitude to each of them individually, because I think Rizek and Murray are really different as characters. And that means that they would both be kind of highlighting different facets of John, and it would really deepen that interaction between the three of them. And then the second thought was just that I don't know what this is doing, but I noticed it. John refers to Kate Murray as Kate in his head, and he refers to George Ryzak as Ryzak in his head. And I don't know what their respective ranks are, and if there's like a familiarity between John and Kate that I'm not familiar with. But that's something that I picked up on, and I didn't know where it was headed, but I hope that it signified something and wasn't just an inconsistency.
I really like that, because I thought the military experience that John had with Rizek, because they, in at least in the American military, people refer to each other by their last names, and so that would set that as a trend. And then his familiarity with Kate, who's a junior officer, and it creates a paternal bond that clearly keeps getting deepened by the way the narrative has their interactions. He helps Kate kind of guide through her analysis of the scene, which I thought was great, that whole sequence, and then how he kind of lets her talk him into taking her with him. Anyway, I totally get what you're saying. I had the same reaction, and I appreciated that. One thing I would say is we generally encourage any feedback at all. We try to maybe discourage people from saying how they would want this or how the story should be written, but there's always to say if like I would want to see more or in order for me to feel a certain way, I'd need more warmth from the characters or whatever else. There's always a way to phrase it in terms of your own reading experience as opposed to a dictation to the author how to write their own story. But this group is fantastic, and we usually have no problems with that. So it looks like everybody's had great feedback on character. We'll move to the next thing. And Kim, I'm going to swing this one over to you because it's something you mentioned. And the actual text of the question from the author is there sufficient level of detail? Do you feel the need for more vivid descriptions? This is kind of a three-parter. If so, what could be described in more intimate detail? And Kim, you had mentioned kind of distance when you read it from possibly a lack of sensory information.
Yeah, although thinking about it, that's kind of the style of the story that I'm just not as intimately familiar with. I haven't read science fiction in a really long time, although I have. And the funny thing is when I first started reading it reminded me a lot of Blade Runner. But also another thing I just wanted to point out is in the very beginning, I didn't read the whole thing, obviously, so I'm a loser. But in the first, I want to say 3 pages, there was a lot of numbers, facts, details, names, and it was almost hard for my brain even to okay, remember car 31 and then car 39. I felt like I was inundated with a lot of stuff, which is incredibly like, it's a specific audience. Like they love that detail and I get it, but I was like, man, this is hard for me to keep up. And so I feel like it was exciting, but I think the other thing is like the rules or the laws of this world. That was another part I had to understand. And I got it like through repetition, but I think that's a major part of understanding this. Like, what are the laws? What are the rules? What are these fulls? Like, why are they present? And I think, I forget your name right now, I'm so sorry, but you referred to it earlier where like we'd want to know like how did we come to this place where these species, there were like 4 of them, right? And there was like this, I guess I just wanted more, there might be other chapters I've missed, but more of like a lead up to how we got here, because I haven't read previous versions of this. So I was like, boom, like on the Autobahn, just like, okay, this is this. And okay, I'm going to accept that. This is what we're dealing with. But it was like, man, I felt like I was reading like a dense, like, microbiology book all of a sudden, like, and I had no background. But at the same time, I thought that specificity worked because it like immerses you in the world. I think the only thing I'd ask for is like more backstory and like drilling down, but then elaborating. Like, so I like one concept, I was like, wait, what are the cars for that puts all this stuff? That was just a little detail. And then like the backlogs and then the network, I didn't understand like what are the ramifications and how could like the network go down? Like what were the loopholes or like what's because when he talks to his supervisor, she's like, there's no way, like these never go down. So it's not just random. Sometimes I just want a little bit more reasons how or why. Just me. Yeah.
Thank you, Kim. Terry, I saw you nodding along to some of that, especially the part about the lots of detail in the beginning.
Yeah, I didn't I didn't have any issues with the detail. I did have issues with the action. I craved more action. I felt like the crime processing scene went on way too long. It had a lot of interesting details. But I also felt like it was a blown opportunity for drama because we're told that this is a major intergalactic incident, it's got potential for a race or a species war. And then they just go about their business as though they're processing any old crime scene. And so there's no angry crowd, there's no nosy neighbors. And so for me, the drama was lacking there. So I didn't have an issue with the detail or the description, except when you contrast it with the way the action's going. And so that would be my take on that.
I'm gonna piggyback on Terry with regard to the crime scene. And just, it felt maybe that a big part of the story, just based on the length of that scene, has to be the reader going along with John, figuring out this mystery and what happened. And so all the clues are very important. We have to know where the body was and what this and it. And I think if that's the case, then it maybe it would have worked better for me if it was a little more simple in terms of what we're supposed to follow along with, because I did get confused a bit. And there's really, I'm not going to remember, what all the details of that crime scene. They're going to have to be brought up again if they're important. If, for instance, one of the foals had struggled and one had not, they had been carrying a Terran, perhaps kidnapping somebody. And then there's somebody had maybe escaped into a building. There was just a lot of different details there. I felt a bit like if it had been simpler, it would have been maybe more engaging. At the same time, I can also see kind of like Kimberly had said about, a type of audience who really loves all the details and will, write them down on a piece of paper and keep track and be really fun to kind of go along with the character and try to figure it out. So I could see both sides of that. And for me personally, I think maybe simpler would have worked better.
Thank you, Jared. Oh, please, Anna, go ahead.
I can kind of piggyback on that in that there seem to be a lot of details, but there's no details that kind of immerse the mood and the emotion behind it. We get that a lot of people are squeamish over dead bodies, and that's repeated again and again and again. But like, there's not much of the narrator interacting with details. Like, the only thing we have is his interaction with mechanics, like the things that scan stuff, but not a lot of like, is it dusty out? Does he have to squint because it's dark? Does, like, is there a chill in the air? How does the fur feel when he like brushes it aside? All of those things that kind of create kind of a mood and ambiance, as well as like what things the character, as a veteran officer of who's seen death before, what things would he notice because he's done this before. So that would kind of create his character a little better as well, by like highlighting what he feels and what he notices through the details.
That's a fantastic point. I think I agree with you, Anna, that a lot of that, although it does feel, again, I have so much confidence in the author that I feel like they're leaving them out on purpose. Like, it's a choice to write in a different way. But I agree with you, Anna, that for my own style, I think I found myself craving at least a little bit of that. Like you said, like, well, how does the fur feel? That's such a great detail, just immediately evocative in my head as my brain is trying to answer it. You have this koala human thing, and anyway, that brings up a lot of interesting stuff. But Laura, Laura or Ian, or Keaton, did you have any thoughts on is there a sufficient level of detail? Do you need more? If so, what could be described more intimately?
I agree with what people have said already about sort of a lot of distant description and not enough of the like tactile detail. I think it did show up. I really appreciated the description of the aliens. I thought that was well done, and I have an image in my mind of them, the blue light, and I think it was mentioned several times that it was cold. I think it was only a couple of times that we had, because the blood was starting to freeze and the warmth was only on the underside of the body. Those were really good points, and I think more of that would be great. I have one small pet peeve that's not quite related to description, but is related to the scene we're discussing, which is that they start investigating the crime scene before the scan is finished. And I was like, no, they're getting in the way of the machines that are doing the scan. And I either wanted it to there needed to be some sort of recognition of why they were able to do that, or for them to wait until the scan was over.
In terms of detail and the things that haven't already come up, a lot of great comments tonight. I thought there were a lot of details that were very effective and immersive. And when I thought about things that might connect me to the story more, if there was a way to feel even more entrenched in it, I kept coming back to John's military background and how that led to or contributed to him becoming a peacekeeper. And both of those roles require a lot of understanding of code. There's like military codes that you have to follow for procedures and stuff, and the same thing with peacekeeping. And I bet that reflects on the world tremendously, especially in a world where there's not homicide, for instance. So it would have helped me learn more about the world if I could see John applying that catalog of information about the structures that support this society as he was going through it. I almost wanted to see what a regular day in the life of John Peacekeeper looked like before he got thrown into this once in a lifetime homicide situation, just for that kind of comparison. And instead, yeah, it felt a little bit adrift when I was floating through it. The only other thing that I would note about details is the natural settings. There was a beautiful paragraph about how life was on the moon with the light being blue toned and it being colder and stuff. But I didn't feel like that had an appreciable effect on the other elements of the story. I didn't know if the scanners had to calibrate for it or if people were dressing in a certain color because it flattered with the moonlight. I don't know. But those kinds of details, I think, would really make it more vivid. But I don't know. It was really good as it was. I don't know if over detail is the solution to it.
All right, so we'll move on to the third question from our author. And is the chapter too long? If so, is it due to superfluous information, or is the information appropriate, but the chapter could be better split into 2 chapters? And Terry, I know you've talked about this a little bit, but you did mention what you've raised as some interesting structural elements. So I don't know if those were related to your previous comments that they got in the way of the drama, or if that is also related to this current question of, is the chapter too long? If so, superfluous information, or should it be split into 2 chapters?
It's not super related. I do think it's too long, just by my sense of what the word count for chapters usually is. I think he's got 2 or 3 chapters here. I as far as the awkward stylistic or structural quirks, there's a few times when time references are connected to trivial actions, like after a minute he scratched his nose. That's not a direct quote. I'm just exaggerating, but there were a few of those. I think it happened like 3 times. That has a weird feeling. I don't know if that's because there's not a lot happening on the outside. It's on the inside, but it did kind of throw me. There's also some times when John declares some common sense things at the crime scene that should probably stay unspoken. And I think one comment was, let's not step on anything that could be important. And just weird comments like that you would never hear at a CSI scene, these days, and I assume more primitive than they are. So that would make me even question his competence. And when you have a world that's so pacifist, the question arises, what would happen to mastery and excellence if it wasn't competitive? And it seems to confirm that, well, you just kind of go soft in the head. You have police who haven't even witnessed a killing in their career, and are befuddled when they're doing their primary role. So it's important to consider, just to address those stylistic and structural things, but then also to consider the job that that Brad has given himself in trying to portray a world that peaceful and yet maintain some sense of drama. I mean, you better have a plan, because things start to feel kind of weird and anti-drama and kind of like half sci-fi thriller, half discussion group. And that was where some of the interiority seemed to go, where John was having these very sensitive thoughts in the middle of this crisis, which supposedly could spark, a species wide conflict. And so it just kind of gave some strange vibrations.
Thank you, Terry. Did anybody else have thoughts on whether or not the chapter is too long? And was that either, if yes, is that because there's too much information or superfluous information, or should it just be split into 2 chapters? And Keaton, let me ask you, did you have any thoughts on that?
Um, Not really anything that hasn't been said already. Yeah, I could see it being 2 chapters. I also agree with Terry. I thought from the crime scene could be, pared down a little bit and a little more, not simplified, but more precise and leave room for, some other stuff. But yeah, nothing new to add.
Ian, as the oh, you're about to jump in. All right, perfect.
Yeah, I definitely want to speak to what's coming in the story. If any of what I know happens next, if the Sioux line get any more involved than they already are, then I think that getting to that part of it a little quicker will only benefit this introduction. I agree with what's been said about the police crime scene, that there's some redundancies in the structure. We get introduced to a lot of characters who then kind of fade to the background in favor of George and Kate and John proceeding with the investigation, and the picking over of the pieces is a little bit redundant. So trimming that portion of this chapter, that's I think the third scene in it, is the only recommendation that I would have, or the only thing that I would hope for a better length for that chapter. And it's because I think that the Sioux line are really cool. They only get mentioned once in this portion of the introduction as the Sioux Line Federation. And I think that if you're going to have this multi-species, multi-planetary stakes, we need to see all the involved parties, not as soon as possible, but as soon as is practical and would make sense. I was really hoping to see Nisha again, but that's all I'm going to say on.
Anybody else with thoughts on whether or not the chapter was too long? And if it was that too much, or it should be split into two? Fantastic. All right, so we'll move on to question 4. Is anything unclear or confusing? Oh, no, wait. Hold on. I'm getting the chopping motion. Author, please come on in. It's 7:52. Oh, I haven't been keeping track of the time at all. Brad, please come on in. Tell us what you think. You have to unmute first, but then we're all ears. Still muted.
Sorry about that. No, I feel like those next 2 questions have already been answered for the most part. And Terry had a chance to talk about his, stylistic and structural concerns. So, and I think we've had a fair amount of discussion about John's internal monologue, which was one of Ian's comments. So I would, rather than talk about those last 2 questions of mine, I would like to spend the next 6 or 8 minutes or whatever focusing on Jared's comment about where the story starts, and your comment, Adine, on the physical ability to see the world, which we might have already covered with a lot of the comments about detail, but if there was anything that you think didn't get brought out, I would be interested in hearing that more than the last 2 questions.
Absolutely. All right, well, let's start with Jared's. Jared, please.
Yes, I was thinking about jumping on the last question because it kind of had to do with this, the too long question. Yeah, no, I thought that the stakes, well, I thought that we could get ahead in the beginning of the book and get going with maybe less information. I know some people also want more information, the struggle of a writer, but I thought that to understand the stakes, we probably could get less and then have what we did need to know come out through, the interactions of the characters and just the action of the story, as opposed to starting with him looking through the files, which did feel a bit like it was only there to give us the information it gave us. It didn't seem to really do anything for the plot that was happening with, this murder, which seemed, yes, it had to do with Foal and these agents that were going around. But at the same time, the real kicker of that whole thing is that it's a murder and there are no murders in this society. And this could cause this conflict between the Foal and the Terrans. And I thought that probably we did need some exposition to understand that. I don't think we could just go into that blind and be okay. But I thought that we probably didn't need an opening scene to give us that exposition.
Does anybody have any immediate thoughts on what Jared just said about the opening and where it starts?
Oh, and I did want to say that I did also maybe agree with Ian about maybe showing the normal day a little bit, although that's always a tricky thing of how to hook readers and everything like that. Although I could see the merit of that as well.
Yeah, that's all I would say is that whatever a normal peacekeeper thing is, do a cool version of that maybe as the opening, and then have them get the call from dispatch about this like once in a lifetime homicide. And that would be a great opportunity to showcase what kinds of crimes might exist or what kinds of need there would be for a peacekeeper in this society where murders don't happen, because otherwise we don't know what their day job is, like Terry mentioned.
I can see it too, like by introducing like a day in the peacekeeper role, having an interaction between a Terran and a foal be a way to, you know, show the interaction between species and the inherent aminicity, as opposed to just like telling it in exposition in the first place.
Laura or Keaton, any thoughts on where the story starts?
I think I agree that it's a little bit too in the weeds at the beginning, with the bit about the vagabond a little bit hard to follow, and it would be better served to have something more grabby, action oriented at the beginning. I like the ideas that people have proposed.
I was going to say that, yeah, as much I start with openings so much. And one thing that seems to be true is that if it's specific and action, then it seems to be in the right direction. Because it's specific to the world and the character, and it can grab you and take you into this unique place, even if it's an ordinary thing. Of course, nothing's ordinary on a different planet in a different galaxy, well, in the same galaxy, but on a planet far, far away. So you have that going for you, that it's already in a strange, interesting setting that, you know, is different enough to hopefully bring a reader along.
Keaton, you unmuted there for a second. Did you have anything to say?
Oh, no, that's what I was mentioning earlier about a little more dichotomy of what their normal jobs are and why it, like, again, why it's like, you know, such a big deal that they don't see this often, more so than telling. So I just don't get like the stakes of, I mean, I get it because if they're not used to it, yes, but like, what do they just normally deal with? But that's all I was going to say.
And Brad, are you okay with suggestions for this opening bit? Okay, all right. Okay, so I had a thought, and it was just the idea of if I wonder if you could compress the normal day peacekeeper bit with needing to tell people what a peacekeeper does on a regular basis, so they can follow what it actually feels like to be confronted with murder when that doesn't happen, and then also keeping it short. And you have this great bit about John inspecting something, but he's doing it from his office, and so I'm wondering if he's actually performing the physical inspection of the alien ship, and so there's an organic place there to explain some of the backstory and some of the aspects of the animosity between him and these aliens. And you also get to see him through the drudgery of his normal days. He's actually doing this physical inspection. So that was just a thought. And again, ordinarily we would push against those, but Brad said it was okay. So I feel not bad suggesting it. All right. So there was one other question, Brad, you wanted us to focus on, and that was whether or not we could see the world. We're coming up on 8 o'clock. I do think people went over that quite a bit, but I'll open it up. Did anybody have any thoughts about, I guess, maybe immersion or their ability to kind of feel in the world based on what was there? Ian, you've been kind of the biggest champion, I think, of the story as it's written. I take it you felt a pretty solid immersion.
Yeah, I was just pulling up my notes on world, and the main things that I understand that comprise world building are describing the man-made spaces as they are answers to the challenges presented by the natural spaces, and the technology that kind of drives that interaction. I thought you did a great job with the technology immersion, but I did have trouble outside of the couple of luminous passages about the planet, visualizing what kind of metropolis we were in, what the environment looks like. Like, are there cars parked on these streets? What do the vehicles look like? Those kinds of man-made structural, architectural almost details. So a little bit more of that would have helped me ground myself in 3D, but I also kind of enjoyed the liminal space of John's head.
Jared, Laura, Anna, did you guys have any thoughts on that stuff? On immersion in the world?
Yeah, I felt immersed, generally speaking. I thought that, especially when we got outside and there was some description of that it helped me. You know, so I thought in that way it did well. I think that the full were described well, and yeah, I think yeah, I was pretty immersed in the story, which I thought was a big accomplishment considering this is sci-fi, and that's such a huge part of successful sci-fi.
Anybody else with thoughts on immersion? Okay. Brad, did you have any follow-up questions or thoughts based on what you've heard tonight?
No, I don't think so. I'm quite satisfied. This is very helpful. It really, I mean, the things I was concerned about, I have some very good information that helps me kind of understand how to revise and rewrite those aspects of the story. And yeah, and I recognize it is, I would say that the pace probably does, it certainly picks up. That's been the hardest thing with this piece, is because I don't know if Ian will remember this from when this was focus grouped, you know, a couple years ago, but everyone wanted a prologue because there was so much information that was kind of crammed into the first couple chapters. And so then I added the prologue. And then the first time we reviewed it here in the Critiquery, everyone hated the prologue. So I took the prologue out, added the information back in. So now, of course, I have this wealth of information and too much telling. And so I'm still struggling to find that balance. But no, this was really helpful. I don't have any follow-up questions, and I really appreciate everyone's time and attention to detail and thoughtfulness in this feedback.
And I'm so glad to watch you go through the struggle, Brad, as I also go through it. So I appreciate getting the chance to see how you deal with this. I have my own first chapter that I'm like slamming my head against the wall over for the same exact reason. But I think I can speak for everybody when I say thank you so much. It was a fantastic pleasure to read your work.
I want to say thank you, and I'm going to stop recording now. So here's where I'm going to do that right
All right.
now.